Chapter 6. Peter Schell was a heavy-set older man whose natural expression was a slight scowl. Even when he smiled, his brow creased downward. Ripley thought he looked like he had bitten into something sour. The man next to him, Keith Dunstan, was much younger, around Billy's age. He was small-boned and wiry, a martial arts teacher. Dunstan had listened to Wilks outline the situation with placid interest, as if he were watching a cast of a tennis match. Ripley had let Wilks do most of the talking to the two men. They had met in the private dojo where Dunstan taught classes. After brief introductions, Wilks had briefly laid out their theory and research. Schell had interrupted several times with questions while Dunstan remained silent, occasionally running a small hand through his short red hair. Both men looked tired.
"So, what if you don't get a transport?" said Schell.
Wilks shrugged.
"Right now, we're trying to get a crew. The more people who have faith in this, the better the chance will be that we will get a ship." "Yeah, but what if you don't?"
Schell's open skepticism was getting on Ripley's nerves. She didn't think he was going to end up working on this. Wilks took that one.
"We'll burn that bridge when we come to it. Any more questions?"
There was a moment of silence. Wilks glanced at Ripley and back to the two men, who sat thinking. Schell scowled at his watch. He stood and reached out to shake hands with Wilks.
"Yeah, I appreciate you inviting me to this, discussion. The dreams will be easier to live with, knowing what you've told me, but I'll have to think about it and get back to you."
Wilks started to say something, but must have thought better of it. He shook hands with Schell. Schell nodded at Ripley and Dunstan, and exited. Ripley sighed. Not everyone they spoke to was going to jump at the chance to risk their lives, of course.
"I'm in,"
Dunstan said. Ripley looked over at the man, surprised. He'd been so quiet throughout the presentation that she'd guessed he wasn't interested. Dunstan didn't look as if he'd said anything important. He sat with the same unreadable expression on his unlined face.
"Let me know what I can do to help you prepare."
Wilks and Ripley both grinned. The sergeant explained the proposal they planned to give to General Peters. Ripley watched Dunstan absorb the information. The teacher seemed to radiate calmness and strength. He would be a good man to have with them. Billy sat on Char Radco's futon and sipped a mug of black tea, waiting for her response. The lieutenant had seemed enthusiastic enough at the beginning of Billy's speech, but now looked apprehensive. She tapped her fingers against her own cup, frowning. Billy remained quiet, not wanting to pressure her. "I don't know," Char said finally. "It sounds good, but I'm not really in a position..." She hesitated. "I had family on Earth," she said. "It's taken me a long time to deal with losing them, and I've worked hard to get where I am now as it is. Some mornings, I'm still barely able to get out of bed." She looked at Billy, searched her face for understanding. Billy nodded. "I just don't... Look, I can't. I'm sorry." Billy tried not to look disappointed, but it must have shown. Char sipped her tea, her eyes troubled. Billy set her mug down and stood to go. "It's okay, Char," she said. "Really. We couldn't have gotten this far without your help. I understand." Billy walked to the door. Damn. She liked the lieutenant, but had been certain she would volunteer. She turned. "If you change your mind." Char nodded, but her forced smile said that her decision was firm. Billy walked out and stood in the corridor for a moment. She shook her head. She did understand. Given that the last couple of weeks had been the only time she'd been able to catch her breath since Wilks had come back into her life, she could see how peace and quiet had a lot of appeal. Then again, she realized she'd spent too much of her life in an enforced peace and quiet to want to sit still for very long, even if there were monsters out there waiting for her.
"Well, McQuaid is in," Wilks said. "And Brewster. Did you get Falk?"
Ripley nodded.
"Yeah. But he lost interest when the question of payment came up. He said he'd consider it if we wanted to buy his time."
Wilks shrugged.
"Not everyone has a cause," he said.
Too bad, though. He had run into Falk a few times on the station. Tall and heavily muscled, he was one of those guys whose loud voice and laugh could be heard in the midst of every card game. Not a real social adept, maybe, but he had the feel of somebody who'd be good to have covering your ass in a firefight. They sat in Ripley's room, going over possible crew members. McQuaid, Brewster, Dunstan, and Jones so far. John Jones was a young medic who seemed too serious for his age. Ripley had seemed tense when Wilks had mentioned the Black Doctor, but had not objected. A medtech would be a necessity. They both knew that. Billie had stopped by earlier to say that Adcox wouldn't be going. She had seemed unhappy about it and hadn't stayed to discuss the trip. Wilks guessed she was at the casting room, looking for Amy. It had become an obsession of hers, looking for Amy. He understood why.
"What about Carvey? And Moto? She's had experience."
Wilks returned his attention to the screen. A light flashed in the upper corner, accompanied by a muted tone, signaling a call. Ripley tapped the receiver. It was Billie.
"Ripley, Wilks," she said, her voice strained. "Tune in military channel 10V, quick!"
She discommed before either of them had a chance to reply. Ripley hit the controls that would switch them to vid. The image on the screen was confused, jumbled. Wilks recognized the inside of an armored personnel carrier. A pair of legs from the knees down ran by, then another set. Apparently, the camera was on the floor. There were shouts and gunfire in the background. A man's voice, near hysteria, called out orders that were barely audible above the din.
"Broilet! Rita! Fall back! Hornoff! Anders! Sights! Respond! Respond! Fuck! There's no..."
The voice was cut off. Wilks started. Hornoff was one of the men listed in the psych files. There was nothing on the screen now except a dim shot of a storage compartment. The picture jerked slightly, as if the APC were being hit. Occasional bursts of gunfire could be heard in the distance, but no more voices.
"What?"
Ripley glanced at Wilks and looked back to the picture. Her expression was part dread and part anger. She knew what she was watching, if not the circumstances.
"Earth mission,"
said Wilks tightly. His knuckles were white. Baco had said there was going to be another.
"Old cast?"
"I don't think so. I was going to look up Hornoff tomorrow." He watched realization flood Ripley's face. She chewed at her lower lip. There was no reason for this to be on unless...
"Somebody fucked up," he said.
Suddenly, there came an alien's hoarse shriek, loud enough that it had to be inside the APC. There was no sound of a weapon to answer its cry. A thick, spidery shape moved across the screen, too close to see clearly. But Wilks knew. Ripley groaned. "Oh, shit." The screen cut to static, then black. Neither of them said anything for a moment, just watched the darkness. A mechanical unisex voice chimed on, informing them that there were technical difficulties. "It was a mistake," said Wilks. The cast had played for less than 2 minutes. If Billie had caught the beginning, the voice meant that it had been pulled on purpose. 10V was a consistently boring channel dedicated to pro-military information programs. Propaganda. He could almost see some vid-tech private sweating in his boots right now. A colossal fuck-up. The wrong tape switched to at the wrong time. Everyone on Gateway tuned in would have seen it. A harried-looking man stepped onto the screen and faced the camera. His brow and upper lip were dotted with sweat. His face and hair looked military, but he was dressed in a rumpled coverall. "It's weasel time," said Wilks softly. "You're on," a voice stage whispered off screen. Live, of course. "We apologize for the interruption in regular programming," he said. "Due to an error in our video room, a transmission of the Earth mission from 5 weeks ago put on." The PR man fumbled his way through a rationalization, obviously unprepared. "What bullshit," Wilks said. "No way that was ever supposed to see air." "We now return to the program. 10V will issue a formal statement at a later time." The screen cut to a spacewalk, some minor fix-it operation on the station. Ripley hit the command, blacking the picture. She turned to Wilks, her face pale and numb. "Won't people know?" Wilks shook his head. "Maybe friends of the dead soldiers? But who will they talk to before command gets to them?" He realized his hands were still in fists and let them relax, taking a deep breath. "This was supposed to be a secret, and they're going to step on it hard. Believe that." Ripley looked at him. "What do you think this is going to do to our mission?" Wilks returned her look, frowning. What would it do? The military couldn't keep people from talking, but it could swing the transport problem either way. "I don't know," he said. "I guess we'll find out soon enough." Billie was getting ready for bed when her comm chinged. She almost ignored it. Whoever it was would try back at another time. She was exhausted, and it was very late. She had gone back to the casting room after meeting with Wilks and Ripley and watched for Amy for another few hours. All 3 of them had agreed it was an accident. Someone had their ass in a sling by now for that little technical error. She had caught the beginning of the transmission and had called the others within 10 seconds. They hadn't really missed anything, except the camera hitting the floor. Billie sighed and stretched. There had been no sign of Amy, and now someone was calling in the middle of the night. She hit receive. "Yes." "Billie, this is Char Radco. I didn't wake you, did I? I'm sorry to be calling so late." Billie felt her sleepiness slip away. "No, I was up. What's going on?" "Did you see 10V Fubar this afternoon?" "Yeah, I saw it." Adcock sounded exhausted too. "I've been thinking about what I saw. It brought back a lot of history. I'm sure it did for others." She stopped, then laughed weakly at herself. I'm sorry. I'm kind of a mess." "You don't have to apologize, Char. It's fine." There was a pause at the other end so long that Billie was about to speak again, when she heard the lieutenant take a deep breath. "I want to go with you," she said. Any trace of hesitation was gone. "If you still want me along, that is. I need to go." This was the voice of the woman that Billie had seen on the tape of the psych files, strong and unafraid. "Good. Welcome aboard." They made arrangements for the next day and discommed. Billie lay down to try to sleep. She instinctively liked and trusted Char Radco and was happy the woman would be coming along. And having one of the linear dreamers on board wouldn't hurt. Billie drifted off to a deep sleep. If the Queen Mother haunted her dreams, the next morning brought no memory of it.